Welcome to the Vanguard podcast, Zohran. Uh, for those who don't know, you ran as an insurgent socialist to represent New York's 36th state assembly, and it looks like you've won the race, but not without a little bit of controversy. Do you have any updates to share with us on the state of that?
Yes, I would sadly say we haven't yet won the race.
Okay.
We are about 589 votes in the lead, and that is after the in-person vote. So almost 8,000 people cast their ballot in person, but so far about 9,000 people have returned their ballots by mail. And they actually have up until tomorrow. Tomorrow, at the end of tomorrow, we will find out the final number of people who return their ballots by mail. I think it could go up to maybe even 11,000. So we've won the first half of the election, and now we wait to hopefully win the second.
Okay. And for listeners that aren't aware, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Zohran Kwame Mamdani. I am a Queens DSA member who is running for New York State Assembly here in District 36, which is a district that comprises Astoria, Ditmars Steinway, and parts of Astoria Heights, basically a good portion of Northwest Queens. And I'm a housing counselor. I work with low to moderate income families across Queens facing foreclosure. And I am also a tenant here in Astoria. And we ran a campaign that was built around the idea of home, that each person should not only have a place to call their own home, but that each person should be able to call this city and this state their home and be able to feel that in a sincere and true way.
Gotcha. And in addition to your run for the state assembly, you also were a rapper for a little bit before that?
Give a dab to your nanny if you're really feeling good. Spin a track for your nanny. Go ahead, make a rap for your nanny. It's a rap. Get the guaps.
I was.
Part of them?
I was. I may still be one. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I started rapping. I mean, I've been rapping with friends for a while, but I think doing it for public consumption since I'd say about 2015. And I made some music with my brother back in Kampala in Uganda, which is where I was born and raised. And then I also made a song here in Astoria, actually filming on the Astoria Boulevard.
Yeah, I checked that out.
Platform.
It was so dope, dude. I love that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny because in 2018, we filmed on a platform for a music video. In 2019, I was on that same platform talking about the need to decommodify housing. So
hell yeah. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, more rappers in politics.
As we said, you're running for state assembly to represent the 36th. For people who aren't familiar with New York State political nomenclature, state assembly is essentially the House of Reps for the state of New York. Could you tell us a little bit about the experience you've had running in the uphill battle of finishing the rest of your primary in a pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely not the world that we had planned for. You know, I'm someone who I've worked on a number of campaigns. I worked on a city council campaign in Bay Ridge, on a state senate campaign there as well. I worked on Tiffany Caban's district attorney race. And so I thought that I would have a pretty good idea of what this campaign would look like. And then, you know, around the middle of March, it became clear that you could not ignore the realities of the pandemic. And we shut our office down, an office that we had spent $12,000 to secure a 4-month lease on. That was going to be like the hub of our entire canvassing and campaign operations. And we shut it down. And for a month, we didn't open it. We didn't use it for anything. But I'm very proud of the fact that, you know, we pivoted in that moment to basically find out how can we continue to be useful through the implementation of our politics through our practices. So what I mean by that is initially after the shutdown, right, you stop canvassing. So we started to figure out how do we make phone calls. The first thing that we made phone calls about was to call our neighbors, to ask them to call their city council person, to put pressure on them to make an issue out of the coronavirus pandemic situation in Rikers Island. Because New York City was considered the epicenter of the virus in this country. And Rikers Island had 8 times the rate of infection than the city did, right? So we were being told to social distance, stay home, and then we had all these people who are in cages who are it's physically impossible for them to distance. So that was the first method of voter outreach we did in the course of this pandemic. And then after that, you know, we partnered, we were a founding member of this group called the Astoria Mutual Aid Society, which is a collective that was founded by a couple amazing people in the neighborhood. And so we implemented that into our outreach because then every conversation we would have on the phone, we would begin it with, you know, we've partnered with a local group that is providing assistance. Do you need any help getting medication or getting groceries? And so at one point we were responsible for 1/4 of all assistance requests that Astoria Mutual Aid received, about 150. And then when Ramadan came around, so I'm Muslim and typically in Ramadan, you know, a lot of people have a basic understanding of the month, but one thing that many don't know is that this is a time when the Muslim community provides food free to anyone and everyone who needs it, typically at religious centers, right? So you go to the mosque and anyone can be provided with food, and it's a source of sustenance for many people who are needy, both within and without the Muslim community. And because of the pandemic, our mosques were closed. And so what we did as a campaign is that we mobilized and raised about $65,000 to purchase meals and distributed over 14,000 meals across the district, investing over half of that money into local businesses right here in Astoria. And so that is, again and again, we were faced with this conundrum of how do you respond to this moment? And I'm so proud of the fact that we were, our belief in socialism was one that was mapped out and played out in every single thing that we did.
Well, I mean, we certainly, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing and the work that you're doing with your campaign. Unfortunately, that ethic of solidarity has been lost on our federal government. And as we reach today's July 1st, people who were relying on the paltry assistance that the government had offered through the extended unemployment benefits are going to lose those benefits this month. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to the impact that's going to have on the people in your city and in your district after the state of New York just lost 32,000 lives to this pandemic. People are still trying to grieve, and now they're being saddled with this economic burden. Could you just speak a little bit more about how that's impacting your community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you put it very well, which is that, we have a massive amount of people have been killed because of this virus and because of government incompetence, not simply federal, but also state and city. And on top of this moment of grief, we have an economic crisis that, again, is not a natural crisis. It's not one that is fated or has to occur. It's one that the government is allowing to take place. I mean, I think that what is so frustrating is that there are so many people who they may not lose their lives in that they will continue to live, but they will lose their lives in that they will lose everything that they had that used to constitute their day-to-day existence, right? People are going to be pushed out of this neighborhood. People have lost their jobs. People might even be pushed out of this entire city. And this is all building on pre-existing crises, right? Here in Astoria, 24% of Astoria tenants are spending 50% of their income on their rent. That's prior to the pandemic, right? We were in a situation where people were, I would go and canvass in the mornings. I would have 7 a.m. canvasses at subway stations. I'd be walking at around 6:30, 6:45. And in the lobbies of the banks on Broadway, which is one of the major thoroughfares here in Astoria, homeless people would be sleeping, right? And what that image just speaks to the fact that we do not have places for people to live, for people to sleep, for people to rest, but we have, these kind of odes to financial capital all across this neighborhood, all across this whole city, state, this country. And that's where people have to lay their head, because that's the only place that they can find respite from the world. So I think that, we are really looking at a massive crisis in this moment. And it's tough because New York State, we're somewhat emerging from the pandemic. Obviously it's really not there, and there's a likelihood of a second wave, but you can feel some semblance of normalcy returning. And yet at this very moment, people are going to have to contend with the end of the moratorium on evictions, right? With the continuing lack of assistance for renters and for small property owners, small homeowners who don't have any assistance with their mortgages. And this is in many ways a driving force in why so many socialists have been running for office, is because we have a state that has abandoned us, and one that has the power to do very different things.
We've seen a lot of adoration and worship from the mainstream media of Governor Andrew Cuomo, and some in lesser extent Mayor Bill de Blasio. Can you speak to us about how their responses has been either adequate or inadequate in your estimation?
I think they've been both fundamentally inadequate, both of them. And I am not a fan of either, but I think that de Blasio gets far worse press than Cuomo, partially because he's just far worse at managing any kind of interpersonal relationships, especially with the press.
Yeah.
But and so with that in mind, I think that we really need to focus a lot more on Cuomo, because not only has he received such stellar accolades for his performance whilst we've had 30,000 plus people die in this state, but he has far more power over the response of the state to this pandemic than de Blasio does. right? Technically, executive powers at the state level, he can overrule almost everything that de Blasio does. I mean, de Blasio, for all his faults, did call for a stay-at-home order.
And Cuomo overruled it.
Right? About a week prior than Cuomo accepted. And initially Cuomo, in his, it's basically just a dick measuring contest between the two of them, to be honest, right? They hate each other, and we are left at the mercy of them having that contest, right? Like de Blasio says something, what is Cuomo's absolute response? Initially, it's always rejected, right? So stay-at-home order request, rejected. A week later, stay-at-home order. But he says, let's not call it by that name. Let's use different language. And I think that it just speaks to the fact that so many people died because of the delays of these two people. And, de Blasio is somebody who, he's just pushed through a budget that refuses to cut money from the NYPD. Like, we're talking about, it is just such smoke and mirrors as to what the actual budget cuts are. And de Blasio was the major force between trying to keep the budget as it is for the New York City Police Department. And then you have Cuomo, who's somebody who, has just not only dragged his feet on this response, but also directly is responsible for so many of the deaths in specifically regarding people in nursing homes, right? Sending people who had the virus back into nursing homes. And there was a period where people called themselves Cuomo-sexuals, right? Where people were, I don't know who wrote this, but it's like, find any white guy in political life that is like at any like mediocre levels of capability, and soon there will be some sexualization of that man, whether it's like Fauci or it's Cuomo. But
yeah, it's really interesting. And then here you have CNN, this beacon of so-called, unbiased media, that's having his own brother interview him in the midst of a global health crisis, talking about how he's his personal hero and Mario, their father, would be so proud, who has his own tumultuous and, legacy in New York. And it's absolutely ridiculous. I don't want to take the conversation too much away from Cuomo, who I believe is extremely culpable, but I'll take another opportunity to kick at Bill de Blasio a bit. You mentioned briefly the much touted so-called billion-dollar shift in resources from the NYPD that's coming as the massive budget cuts and austerity measures are being taken as a result of the coronavirus. Even the New York Times is describing it as a budgetary sleight of hand. They're claiming that they're cutting the budget by not hiring new officers as they plan to, things like that. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit and how they're ignoring the true need to defund the police as a means of restructuring it completely from the ground up.
Yeah, I think that, look, they cut 1 out of 4 cadet classes next year. The headcount of the police department will go up next year. How we can call this a serious cut to the police is beyond me. And I think it really does also speak to the fact that the city council is one of the last legislative bodies that has not had a large-scale set of competitive elections since the resurgence of leftist electoral organizing here in New York City. You can feel that, and that is not my analysis. That's a friend of mine, Daniel Lynch, was talking about that last night, where you can really feel how the much vaunted progressive class of 2013 in New York City local politics has brought us to this point, right? And I think that it's not only is it a sleight of hand, it is, they basically attempted to take school safety agents, cops in schools, and take that funding out of the Department of Education as opposed to the NYPD. It does nothing to contend with, the critique and the demand of $1 billion is not because that is the amount of money that will solve everything. It comes out of an understanding that policing is something that does not create safety. And what we need to do is reinvest into things that are proven indicators and creators of safety. And the city council budget did not do that. And it's just mind-blowing to see the scale of cuts that every other department will be facing. And then just this slim, almost just a shave off the top that the NYPD will see.
It mirrors exactly the military budget cuts that Bernie Sanders and the Progressive Caucus proposed, a 10% cut to the military budget to pay for COVID, which isn't even as much as we increased the military budget with Trump's last military budget before COVID happened. So we're not even getting back before we were to get ourselves out of this crisis. It just mirrors it exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's, That's why we continually need to build pressure on these people. And next year, 70% of city council seats will be open, and there will be the 70% of incumbents will be term limited, and the ones that are remaining will be jockeying for a position as the speaker of the city council. And we have a real opportunity here to create a sea change in terms of the elected class of city council people. And I think that it's not we cannot afford to only have people respond when we have mass movements out in the street. We need to be able to have people in office who will not require that kind of pressure to do the right thing. Because, we had 50A repealed at the state level, right? The same electeds who were not pressuring leadership and the same leadership who were refusing to bring the legislation to the floor for a vote changed after millions of people marched, and then they brought it to the floor for a vote. They voted and they said, look at us, we're doing this. I think that we need elected officials who are able to understand and do things that are actually in response to the scale of the crisis prior to them having no other option.
Sure. Well, yeah, we've been talking to a lot of other kind of insurgent, progressive, socialist candidates who have, run hard-fought, albeit uphill battles against, the Democratic establishment or the Republican establishment, the political establishment in general. Yesterday, we, of course, unfortunately saw candidates like Charles Booker and Andrew Romanoff lose their races to their corporate counterparts in Kentucky and Colorado. As a progressive or socialist insurgent yourself, can you just tell us what it's been like running as an insurgent against an established incumbent, and just what that experience has been?
Yeah, I think that when you run as an insurgent, when you run against an incumbent, you face a whole set of advantages that they have that you will never have, right? On the first day that we announced this race, my opponent had $100,000 in the bank. I had zero. And so you're working at a net deficit just to begin with. You work to send out pieces of mail, and each piece of mail, let's say, costs at least like 50, 60 cents typically. And then your opponent can not only send out pieces of mail, more pieces because they have more money, but they can also send out pieces of mail from the government that are just like regular updates from your assembly person. Mm-hmm. And because elections are in many ways won or lost on name recognition, It doesn't matter that those pieces of mail are not ostensibly campaign literature, because just by featuring the name in such a heavy way, it is another way of persuading voters. Those are difficulties, and then they do all sorts of things. My opponent's campaign was calling voters and saying I was an independent, that I wasn't a Democratic candidate in the primary, right? So then you had people who thought that I wasn't contesting this race, or that I was, but that I wasn't a Democrat, or, all these kinds of methods of confusion. Additionally, it's not a fair fight, right? And we know that because, and frankly, in the context of the world, we have a much better chance here in terms of winning these kinds of elections than so many other activists do elsewhere. And I oftentimes remind myself of that, right? That, I still can get a voter file. I still can know where, who the voters are in this district. When there's not a pandemic, I can knock on their doors. When there is, we can still find ways to interact with them. But there are these difficulties. And, we put out a platform about taxi driver rights and about rideshare worker rights and about the need to ensure that people are paid a fair wage, and that Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, Via drivers, they're classified as employees and not as contractors. And then a couple of weeks later, a group that was funded to the tune of $1.1 million by Lyft starts to advertise on Spotify in support of the incumbent, saying that she'll defend us from extremists, which is me, right? and it's, you just kind of realize that there is never you can never ensure that it's just one-to-one.
Oh yeah.
Right? Yeah. When you go up against an establishment figure, there will be other opponents that come up through the course of the race. And frankly, when you're running at this low of a level, you feel it a lot less. But if you're Jamal Bowman running for Congress, you're having to contend with millions of dollars being spent by a super PAC, right? And it's fundamentally unfair, but the way in which we make it up is through our organizing.
Yeah.
And I think more and more you can see the professionalization of the left in that we are, Daniel Marins is a reporter for the Huffington Post. He wrote an article about Jamal Bowman's race, and he kind of laid out the ways in which this wasn't just a classic like David versus Goliath race, right? This was a left that is learning from the mistakes of past elections and incorporating things so that when we cast out corporate candidates, we don't similarly cast out any semblance of professionalism of campaigns that also those candidates also had, right? we take the things that work and we cast out everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and it's definitely an interesting race there, because Jamal Bowman, of course, got the endorsements of, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Elizabeth Warren, right at the crucial moments. Whereas, yesterday in certain races, like with Andrew Romanoff, we saw figures like Elizabeth Warren jump in to endorse his opponent, Hickenlooper, right at the last couple of weeks, which is just, devastating for those of us who care about progressive causes. And that, at one point thought Senator Warren was also cared about progressive causes. Did you face anything like that? Established New York politicians coming in to endorse your opponent at the last minute to try to quash your energy or momentum?
Absolutely, but nobody with the power that any of these figures would have.
Yeah.
Right? I think it's a testament to the organizing that we did that not a single elected official in an overlapping district endorsed my opponent.
Nice.
But my opponent came into office 10 years ago and is not only part of the same political class, but is friends with a lot of the other people who are in this district and in surrounding districts, and yet no one else in this district endorsed her. And that is not because we're friends. That's because there's a political calculus as to, where this district is at and where it's going. That being said, there were many, there was a time at which we were almost going to receive a very pivotal endorsement that would have really assisted our campaign. And it was quashed because a lot of progressives, electeds across New York State came together to push for that endorsement to not occur. And, you face that kind of stuff. And I think that's, this is not, I was not running a race against a Republican. I was running a race against someone who self-identified as progressive. And this race was in many ways about, the difference between having a vision that is grounded in democratic socialism and having a vision that is grounded in incrementalism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no surprise to me. I'm not sitting here being like, how could they do this? The same people that pushed for that endorsement to be nixed have the same ideology in many ways as the person who I challenged. So it's no surprise to me. But I think that it's kind of like when we look back on Bernie post Nevada, right, post South Carolina, when all of these other candidates coalesced. This should not be surprising to us. This is not like some vast conspiracy theory. This is just natural interest. We would do the same thing on the other side.
They should have prepared for it, I agree.
Exactly. And I don't mean this as a critique on Bernie, but more as one also on the way that we understood it, that we have to prepare for that at every single level, which is that you're not just going up against one person. You're going up against that person, and then all of the interests that person has allowed to continue to flourish. And they will do everything they can to stop you. I mean, sometimes it doesn't work though, because I went to a coffee shop to put up a poster, and somebody was like, "Oh, I heard your ad on Spotify," and the ad that they had heard was the Lyft ad against me. They're like, "I'm voting for you." I was like, "That's great, thank you."
Yeah. One of the things that we wanted to kind of touch back on, you mentioned the astronomically high rent prices in your district. Obviously, people are pretty familiar with the fact that it's incredibly expensive to live in New York City as the result of the fact that all residential housing has been turned into an investment for the rich. You've talked about how people are spending more than half of their paychecks on rent. Could you just talk about how that's creating vast housing unsustainability? There are more than 60,000 people without shelter every night in New York City, something entirely unacceptable in the richest country in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you hit the nail on the head. We are in a situation where we're in a massive housing crisis, and who knows what it looks like right now with the pandemic. But prior to the pandemic, the definition of rent burdened is when you spend 30% or more of your income, and almost 50% of Astoria is rent burdened with regards to tenants, right? And then we have this 24% spending more than 50. And I think it just speaks to the fact that development in and of itself will not save us, right? Astoria has built 7,500 new units in the last 5 years. But the bulk of those units are not units that are catering towards people who the market has left behind. What we need to do is build housing explicitly for those who the market does not cater to. Because even our affordable housing in this moment is housing that is like a studio apartment on Steinway Street that costs over $2,150 a month, and you need to earn more than $70K a year to even apply for. Right? We need to build housing. That housing that we're building that's considered affordable is housing that is already being built by luxury developers. The person making more than $70K, if they want to spend $2,150 on a studio, they can find it in this market, right? But what about the people who are not earning that money? And that's what's so frustrating, is that people treat so much of this as if it's fated, as if it is just the way it has to be. And it is not. You know, we have so many opportunities here in this city to change the direction and ensure that we can actually have people afford to live here. Because so much of what the city has become is a playground for the rich. And we need to ensure that we use every possible avenue to make clear that it is not the way that we can continue to let it be.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly well said.
Yeah. Well, any more questions, Zach?
Yeah, well, just one more thing I wanted to ask you before we left is about the transportation system in New York City, and how mass public transportation for all is something that we need to adopt in every major city in this country, specifically New York City, where the infrastructure has already been built. And actually, as somebody that's running to represent the people up in Albany, that's something that, if I'm not mistaken, you have unique position to bring change through.
Absolutely. You know, we've been pushing for free transit. It's something that's been a part of our platform for quite a while. I think that, you know, when we talk about dignity for all, we have to understand that public transportation is part of what allows people to live a dignified life. And, you know, we have an executive here in New York State, Governor Cuomo, who unilaterally shut off overnight service for the subways. And who knows when that'll come back, right? We are facing an MTA that is looking at massive cuts in order to deal with the deficits that they have. And what we need to do is raise taxes on the ultra wealthy. We can raise over $35 billion if we raise taxes on the ultra wealthy here in New York State. There are more than 110 billionaires in the state alone. And, you know, in New York State, the income tax rate, it's a progressive tax rate up until a certain point, right? So, you know, it increases the more money you make. And then when you hit $1 million, 8.812. So if you make $1 million a year, or you make $1 billion a year, you're paying the same tax rate. And it just makes no logic. If you're going to have progressive taxation up to a certain point, continue that.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that we absolutely need to have free transit. Sadly, there are so many fights even before then that we have to fight for, just to resume the overnight transit, just to ensure that we have fair fares, which is basically subsidized transit for the poorest New Yorkers. And, you know, we really need to make sure that these are not negotiable things, right? That these are tenets of our society, that everyone should have the right to be able to go across the city for work, for play, for whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We couldn't agree more. Where can people go to support you if they share your values? Yes,
they can come to our website. It's zohranforassembly.com. That's ZOHRANFORASSEMBLY.com. So the complicated part is my first name. For Assembly is as it is. You can find me on social media at Zohran K. Mamdani on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We also have a lot of merchandise, so come through and buy some, because we are probably going to need to raise a lot of money for legal fees in this absentee count. So I hope to see people there.
We wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, we're going to be watching that race closely to see what the result is, and we really do wish you the best of luck.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
thanks for coming on.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.